Thanks, David, for joining us today. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule just to have a chat. I've been really looking forward actually to talking to you, believe it or not. This sort of appointment, on my schedule has been something I've really been looking forward to. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for making the initial approach. It's very good of you.
Yeah, it's with running a podcast, it's interesting because you'll contact loads and loads of people, and then, well, at first I thought everyone's just going to reply, but you actually find out how busy people are, and some people don't see your messages, some people just don't reply because there's other things to do. So it's interesting actually how tricky it can be sometimes to get people on. So yeah,
it's a bit like completing surveys. So people quite often at university will be doing a quantitative or qualitative research, and they just don't get the number of hits that they wanted, and it really screws the whole analysis. So
hard to draw any conclusions from 16 people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We all have different opinions.
Yeah. So I just actually wanted to start off by giving you my thanks for your involvement in the armed forces, and I think something that maybe I've noticed my wife's actually from America. In their culture, it's very common to say when you meet someone who's been involved in the military, to thank them for their service. So I think actually that's something I really admire. So just wanted to start off by thanking you for the service you've given for your country. So. You've had my thanks and my family's thanks for that.
Well, Josh, I appreciate that. I think it's interesting how the American population view the armed forces compared to the British population, for example. I think that the appreciation of the military over the years has increased in the UK. I think I was fortunate enough to be the Chaplain General from 2014 to 2018. So the Chaplain General, Her Majesty's Armed Forces, Her Majesty's Land Forces. So at the same time as I was looking after all the chaplains in the army, I had a colleague who was the chaplain of the fleet, looking after the chaplains in the Navy, and the chaplain chief Royal Air Force. So we had three separate branches: Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Royal Marines are wrapped into the Navy.
Yes.
So I was solely responsible for Army chaplaincy. But it is very interesting to compare how other countries view their chaplaincy, and I was lucky enough during my time to have some exposure to that.
Yeah, no, the culture, I guess, in America is very, people are very appreciative, and they also seem to know a lot more people that go into the military professionally, maybe than, I'm only talking for myself here, but I actually didn't know too many. I think my grandfather was involved in the military and a few other people, but actually when you talk to nearly anyone in America, I know I've got this many friends that are involved, and my dad was in this, and it seemed a lot more common for people to get involved. I guess that's just by virtue of having a larger military, by numbers. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think the other side of it is that when for a time I was the chief chaplain of the Chaplains Training School, and every year we would have theological students used to come to visit us and see what military chaplaincy is all about. And one of the things I used to say to them was, you may not know somebody who is directly in the military, but I guarantee you, if you look and talk to people in your parishes and in the churches you come from, there will be a huge number of people, present and in the past, who have had military service in the Army, Navy, or the Air Force. And I think them having some sort of understanding of military chaplaincy opens a door to a conversation, which they may not have thought was possible.
My father's father, my grandfather, he was, I think, in the Royal Artillery, if I'm getting the name right. So I think he was stationed across Germany and things like that. So my dad grew up actually, he was born in Nuneaton, and I think he grew up in a few boarding schools actually in England, and then also spent time in schools in Germany. So I think he was all over the place really, but it took him to a lot of places. I know that for sure. But what was your initial, what initially exposed you to the world of the army and the military? What first got you involved with that whole world?
I think there was the whole idea of service, Josh. So I started when I was at school. I was an air cadet at school. My father had done not national service, but at the end of the Second World War, he had been a trainee navigator in the Air Force.
Okay.
Of course, there was no conscription in Northern Ireland, so he had volunteered to do that. He became a policeman in his life, and I suppose the idea of service was always something that appealed to me. I applied for the Air Force initially when I was 16 to do a flying scholarship. I failed with distinction. I couldn't do the wiggly amps on the science paper, and the idea of joining the Air Force as a pilot wasn't going to happen. And I started looking around. The careers thing offered the other services, and I saw the Army, and I really liked that. So I actually joined the Army originally as an infantry officer rather than as a chaplain.
Okay, yeah. So as a
I did my first degree at Queen's, paid for by the Army.
Okay, so the Army paid for you to go through your
So I was a cadetship officer. So I had been selected for a career in the military, but it still have the cadetship scheme, which gave me a bursary through the time that I was a student. And then I was committed to, after my 4 years at university, to fulfilling at least another 5 years in the military thereafter.
And were your studies in subjects relating to the military, or was it kind of, did they pay you to go through it as a,
some people are sponsored because of the technical backgrounds. They need, the military is a very scientific organization in many ways. It's a very technical organization. So some people have gone to university to do engineering, for example, or electronics, or cyber now, of course, the big thing. No, I read history, and I think the military, one of the things about that, of course, the military is recruiting from a broad sector of society, and they want people with a broad breadth of interests. So having a history degree was very common.
Was that something you wanted to study or always had your eye on, that kind of?
Yeah, it's. I think so. I think when I was at Queen's, I had some friends who were church students. I toyed with the idea of giving up my history degree to go and read theology. It would be complicated to do that because I was committed to staying in the Army at that time, and the timing wasn't right. So I thought, no, I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm going to read history. I will graduate for that, and then I'll go off to Sandhurst.
And even from those early stages, then there was the interest in theology and the church, and you had an interest in ministry, perhaps from even.
Yeah, then? I think so. I think from when I was a teenager, I became a Christian when I was 16. There a friend at school. I think, like a lot of young men, even in the early 70s, or the late 60s, early 70s, probably the early 70s, that it was okay to believe in God. A lot of young men find that quite difficult even today.
Yes.
And I find with young soldiers that it was okay to believe in God. And I had this, I've always had this deep belief in God. I came from a church family, and the idea of going into the military was something that sat very easily with my Christian faith and with my beliefs.
Okay, yes. Sometimes these days, even, admitting that you believe in God can be like an object of ridicule in itself from some people, which is interesting.
Exactly.
Even the changes.
And there's a lot of negative Christianity that goes on. Christians don't do this, don't do that, do the other thing. Well, let's flip on this head. What do they do?
Yes. Well, my dad always said the exact same thing. He said people in work would be like, "Oh, well, you can't drink, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't go to clubbing," and then he was like, "Well, it enables me to do all these number of other things, So that's funny enough. That's something my dad actually always said himself. He would have taught the Bible class, for sort of 11 to 15-year-olds in our church for a while. So that was always his motto to just remember it's the things you can do, not the things you can't do. So that was then you were interested, I guess, in the theology side of things, but then obviously also interested in getting involved in the army. So where did that lead you then next? Once you were a cadet and then you studied?
So once I graduated, I went to Sandhurst, to the Royal Military Academy of Sandhurst. I was commissioned into the Royal Irish Rangers, and I absolutely loved being a soldier. I loved the privilege of being a platoon commander. I commanded 8 platoon of 2 Royal Irish. I had 30 soldiers in my care, and I loved every minute of it. Over the years, you get promoted, you move around to different jobs. I got married not after the first year of my training, and we went to live in Berlin, for example, in our first. So as a newly married couple, And that was a big adventure,
This would have been West Berlin at that stage.
Yeah,
Then?
but
Yeah.
in the old days, you had to go through the corridor and
Wow.
living behind the wall. It was a fascinating time. Arriving in the Berlin winter where it seemed to snow every day.
What was that like, being in that environment? Just in.
Extraordinary. The great thing about the military, of course, you travel around the world with 600 of your friends.
Yes.
Because it was the whole battalion. We'd been in Tidworth on the edge of Salisbury Plain, and then we moved across to Germany, and the whole battalion and their families moved as well.
Wow.
So you move as a little community from one part of the country to another. And I think one of the things that the military is really good at is looking after its people. Because you do live together, you work together, you pray together. And it's really important for the community that we care for our people. That's absolutely.
This is something I probably didn't actually know. You travel, or people travel with their families rather than their their wives and children staying at home, wherever that is. They actually traveled as a unit.
Yeah, much more so in the army. Probably, I think the army's more static now than it used to be, and a lot of operational tours clearly happen when you're married and unaccompanied. But certainly moving regiments from Scotland to Germany, the whole lot go.
Yeah.
Wow. And that's quite a privilege. So, and that's why a lot of army children end up going to boarding school, because of continuity of education.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you can't move from one school to another, and you're moving from Germany to England maybe, and then back to Scotland or back to Northern Ireland.
Yeah. That was my dad. Yeah, he would have been, I think, 2 or 3 different boarding schools. But I guess it's not too many for someone that's traveling around a lot. But I think he said he went to boarding school near York, and then he also said there was one he was at that was quite close to one of the major concentration camps. Actually, he was telling me, I think they were only a stone's throw, somewhere like Belsen, or one of, that's Belsen's in Norway, maybe.
Yeah.
Or what? Yeah.
So Belsen in the north of Germany.
Is it? Maybe that was the one. Yeah. I was trying to remember. I think
Hohn and Fallingbostel are the two big bases. Used to be in the north of Germany. And so one of the things that has happened, Josh, in my tenure as the Chaplain General, I'll come back to the transition from being in the infantry, was that we were closing down Germany. So a lot of the bases that your dad would have remembered, a lot of the places of his childhood and where he was at school, there is no longer any British soldiers based there.
Yeah.
So we've all come back pretty much to the UK and been re-garrisoned around the world, but there are very, very few British soldiers still serving in Germany today.
Yeah, it was that transition phase, I guess, but from one. Yeah. It was a whole paradigm shift really in Europe, I guess, and the fall of communism, and even slightly before that, and it's very interesting. I mean, I almost envy the travel aspect of the military and getting to see these different places and be stationed in different places. Were you in a number of different countries yourself, or? Yeah,
so initially with the Rangers, we started off in the edge of Salisbury Plain, then we went out to Berlin. We then came back, because I was in the Rangers. I went to Ballymena to the Rangers depot, and then ended up going back to Dover, so I finished my time in Dover, and but between those times you do overseas trips. So yes. I did a tour in Cyprus. I did some time in Canada. I went to Jamaica to work in the jungle. Jamaica sounds like a holiday island, but it's primary jungle.
Right.
So that was fantastic in 1982.
Brilliant.
Working in the jungle was just completely different than anything I've done before since.
Oh, I can imagine.
But that was great.
I wouldn't even have thought that the British Army would have. I mean, I guess it makes sense when you think about it, but Jamaica seems a very long way away,
Yeah, it was. It was to do with partly because of where there's jungle that you can train in, and partly because the Jamaican Defence Force wanted to send some soldiers to the UK. And we did a company exchange. So my company went to Jamaica for 6 weeks, and the Jamaicans came to the UK for 6 weeks, just after the Falklands War.
And did part of your service involve them working in Northern3 and in that conflict?
So when I was in the infantry, I did the 2 years in Ballymena. As a chaplain, I did 3 subsequent tours in the province. Once in North Belfast, once on the border in South Armagh, and then once I was the senior chaplain eventually in Lisburn,
Right.
So I did, yeah, so I did move around. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Yeah.
house that we're living in is our 18th home.
Wow. I don't even want to think. I mean, I've got married at the end of last year, so we done one house move. We were originally in Ballynahinch and then moved to East Belfast, and even the thought of transporting all that stuff again, I couldn't even imagine doing that 18 times. But
Yeah. You get
that's
to know what you like and what you don't like, I can tell you.
streamline the process. So obviously, yes, you're involved as an active soldier as such, but then the transition to chaplaincy. Tell me how that happened.
Okay, so I always had this niggling call from God to go into the church.
Mm-hmm.
Probably going back to my school days, certainly through my university time. As I said, yeah, I loved being in the Rangers, but this niggling call from God to go into the church would not go away. I thought about it a lot. I prayed about it. I spoke to friends and colleagues in the army, including some of my chaplain friends, and they said to me, "You're never going to know whether this is right for you unless you put it to the test."
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, so if I'm having grown up in the Irish Presbyterian Church,
Mm-hmm.
should I apply to the Presbyterian Church in Ireland? And said, well, you can do, but actually, this is in the mid 80s now.
Mm-hmm.
The Church of Scotland is the umbrella church for all Presbyterians in the army. And it's really the mother church of the Presbyterian Church.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's a much broader church. We feel you'd be better suited to the Church of Scotland rather than the PCI, Presbyterian
Mm-hmm.
Church in Ireland.
Yes.
So I decided that the time was right that I should apply. I say we were married with no children. I really felt called by God to go and do this. My friends in the regiment thought I was committing financial suicide.
Mm-hmm.
We were in those called dinkies, double income, no kids. My wife's a teacher.
Yes.
And we had a very good lifestyle. I loved what I was doing. We were very happily married. We still are very happily married. But this niggling call would not go away.
Mm-hmm.
And my father, who was very religious, thought I was being irresponsible because my career was going well. I'd been promoted,
Mm-hmm.
obviously going in the right direction.
Yes.
And but he felt that the responsible thing to do, given the fact that I had a wife and a mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
was to soldier on.
Yeah.
I decided I would apply to the church anyway. I applied to the Church of Scotland. I was accepted as a candidate. And when I got the letter of acceptance, I resigned my commission the next day.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't mean I could leave the next day. I had to give 6 months notice, but that allowed me to leave the army. I was commanding a company in Cyprus at the time. So I had to get back from Cyprus. We had to move house, and I ended up going to be a student at St Andrews in Scotland,
Okay.
as a Church of Scotland candidate,
Mm-hmm.
where I was a kept man for 4 years. I had a student grant. I'd given up my career, and my wife's a teacher, and she mercifully got a teaching job, and
Mm-hmm.
she taught while I studied for 4 years at St Andrews.
That in Scotland, yeah.
Before getting ordained into the Church of Scotland, yeah.
Okay, and then so at that stage, then you'd applied, been accepted. What does the role of an army chaplain look like, or a chaplain working in the military? What does that
So
in practice look like?
Okay, so to be a chaplain, you have to be an ordained minister or priest of one of the main denominations. So in the chaplains department, we had Church of England chaplains, Roman Catholic chaplains, Methodist chaplains, chaplains from the United Board, and I've forgotten one. There were 5 different groups, all from the main Christian denominations. Latterly, we had a couple of Salvation Army officers became chaplains, although we had them during the war. So when I was ordained into the Church of Scotland, I had a number of options. I could apply for a parish. I applied for an academic job. I could go into some form of chaplaincy, and I really felt called to go back to the army. So I applied, was accepted, and went back to the army as a trainee chaplain. And you do some training, and then you get posted to your first unit, and you really learn on the job, pretty much. I'd already been to Stanter, so I didn't have to learn the military background. I needed to learn how to exercise ministry in the military environment.
So you don't need a military background to be a chaplain in the
Absolutely not.
military?
No. So
Mm.
we send chaplains as professionally qualified officers to Sandhurst. They're trained how to be officers. They're trained how to represent the core values of the army. They're trained how to exercise their ministry, be it a doctor or a nurse, a dentist. It doesn't matter what you are. If you're a professionally qualified officer, you'll all be trained together.
And
so you can effectively work in the military environment.
do chaplains have any military obligations in terms of actually getting involved in the military side of things, or is it a completely distinct, almost branch, within the army?
Completely different, distinct. The great privilege is when you get posted to your first regiment, they will often allow you to wear their headdress, because if they wear a particular hat, or you can wear some of their flashes to say that you belong to that particular regiment. But we try to ensure that chaplain's identity is preserved. We don't want people. Soldiers don't need another officer running around who's trying to be more green than they are.
Okay.
They want people who will be different, but who will walk alongside them.
Yeah.
So everywhere the soldiers go, a chaplain will go with them. So one of the things we tried to do was that every major deployable unit, which is anything from up to 600 people, when they deploy around the world, both in peacetime and in war, we will ensure a chaplain goes with them.
I actually wouldn't have assumed that the ratio would have been that high in terms of chaplains per soldiers. I would have thought maybe it would have been, one chaplain per 1,000 or more. But
no. So in the army, when I was chaplain general in the army, I had the army was about 70,000 strong, and I had 150 regular chaplains, full-time chaplains, about 75 reservist chaplains, part-time chaplains who were ministers and priests.
Yeah.
At the same time, and we had about 100 cadet force chaplains.
Wow.
All of whom under the badge of the Royal Army Chaplains Department.
So clearly, this is it's quite a priority in the army's whole. To have a chaplain is definitely something they prioritize. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. So any commanding officer worth his salt. So the commanding officer of a regiment or a battalion will have 600 soldiers, or up to maybe 400 to 600 soldiers, depending on the size of the unit, plus the families to look after. And every commanding officer will want his own doctor, and they will want his own chaplain to look after their people.
So the role of a chaplain really, does it go beyond the spiritual in terms of is it a counselling role with spiritual guidance, or are they running is it like running church services, or what does that role
look absolutely
like?
So over the years I've run 7 different army churches in sort of garrison towns, but of course when the soldiers deployed, I deployed with them. One of the things I really miss now as a parish minister is working in a chaplaincy team. So when we deployed, it's rarely you would just have one battalion or one chaplain, you'd have a whole team of people. But all chaplains are there to provide 3 things: pastoral care, spiritual support, and provide moral guidance to the soldier and their families. Pastoral care, spiritual support, moral guidance, and soldiers and officers understand that. So when a young soldier, boy or girl, joins the military at one of the recruit depots, be it as a 16-year-old or even as an adult, in the first week that they're at the training depot, they will be introduced to one of the training chaplains, who in some cases has to explain, this is what I am. I wear crosses on my collars. I am a minister or a priest of whatever denomination. This is what I can do for you. Because some of them have got no church background whatsoever.
Well, I was just about to ask that. So for those with no church background at all, is it interesting then to provide a level of support where I suppose as Christians you'd be used to this standard spiritual guidance you may give someone, but then it's completely, well, not totally different, but it's a different way of looking at it when it's on a secular basis. Is that...
I think one of the big things, Josh, is that you're with people all the time. So they talk about the ministry of presence. You're actually with people morning, noon, and night, Monday to Friday, as well as Saturday and Sunday. So you're not just seeing people for an hour on a Sunday morning. You've actually got the opportunity. It's the relationships you're building up in the workplace, that you're building up when you're doing PT with them, that you're building up when you're in exercise, that you're building up when you're in operations.
Mm-hmm.
And you're the one that they will come to. And there's no greater compliment paid to a chaplain when a
Mm-hmm.
soldier or an officer comes to you and says, Padre, because that's the neutral title, you're not called by your military rank.
Mm-hmm.
Padre, can I have a word?
Mm-hmm.
And that only comes around because you are seen as a trusted friend and
Yes,
colleague.
yes. That the relationship is there to a level
Exactly.
that they can, yeah, confide in you.
Yeah, and so going back to time in Germany, I was stationed twice in Germany as a chaplain, and a young soldier comes to see and says, "Padre, can I have a word?" He comes, he arranged to meet, and he said, "I'm really worried about my grandmother. My grandmother brought me up.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother's seriously ill. My grandmother's dying. Um, I would like to go back to Scotland for her funeral,
Mm-hmm.
but the military won't let me go.
Yeah.
Why will they not let you go? Because you're needed here. Secondly, because your grandmother was not your next of kin. Your mother, who you don't have a great relationship with, is your next of kin. Your
Mm-hmm.
grandmother wasn't. So I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to go to your grandmother's funeral,
Yeah.
or she's seriously ill." Then you end up talking to this young person, trying to help them through this difficult time,
Mm-hmm.
and you're providing pastoral care for them, and it's a relationship you can carry on when the next time you meet them in the barracks or
Mm-hmm.
out somewhere, and then you're able to build a relationship which allows you to say, "Can I say a prayer for you and your grandmother and your family?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh, and 9 times out of 10, they'll say, "Yeah, that'd be great." Or, "Would
Yeah.
you like to come to the church and we'll meet and discuss it?"
It's funny
Light a
because
candle.
I hear that very often actually that people are hesitant to offer prayer to others, but then when you actually do give that offer of prayer, people very rarely turn it down because that's it's a kind gesture no matter what culture you're really from to know that someone's is there to pray for you.
Yes, and you can say absolutely pray for them. Theodore Bailey Hardy, who was known as Woodbine Willie during the First World War,
Mm-hmm.
used to say, "You can pray with your soldiers sometimes, but you must pray for them always."
Mm-hmm.
And David Connor, who's the Bishop of Windsor, who used to be the Bishop of the Armed Forces, David Connor used to say, "A soldier will forgive you anything as a chaplain, except not saying your prayers."
Right.
So
Yeah.
the soldier expects you to be a good chaplain.
Yes.
They don't expect you to be a good army officer.
Right. Yes. Well,
But
I
at the
guess
same time,
yeah,
the army expects you to do that regardless.
that's from that way that I guess they view you as distinct, but you're
Yeah.
obviously you're part of the fabric of their of the armed forces, yet distinctive, and um, so I was going to ask you then, in terms of actually providing the support for these for the soldiers. Do you find that similar topics come up sometimes? Do you find that I guess there's that whole thing of PTSD is a big issue and things of that nature, or even do people find maybe they have moral objections to things that are going on? Are there recurring themes that come up, or is there a million different topics you've had to deal with over your
And
time?
it's quite often very random things. With young soldiers, it's a lot to do with relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to do with Padre, can I have a word? I've got my girlfriend pregnant. Padre, I've been accused of rape. Why did she
Wow.
accuse you of rape, not anybody else? Padre, I'm stuck in the army for the next 3 years and I don't want to be here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do to get out? What we did always when I was in a battalion was I worked very closely with the doctor. So you have a regimental medical officer.
Mm-hmm.
So occasionally I would see somebody was suffering from stress or post-traumatic stress or some level of trauma. And they came to see me. I would say, "Have you seen the doctor?"
Mm-hmm.
And they say, "No, I don't want to go to the doctor." I said, "Look, I tell you what, I can't help you with what I think might be wrong with you, but why don't I go with you to the doctor?
Yes, that level of moral support that
And I
they
will
may
walk
need.
with you and we will look after you.
Mm.
And I know the doctor is a good chap and he will look after you and give you what you need and signpost you to where you need to go."
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the doctor occasionally would say to me, "David, would you see somebody because they need just a bit of listening to.
Yeah.
They need they're feeling a bit fragile. They need a bit of space." Are you prepared to spend time with them? And of course you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you have a duty of confidentiality really in that role?
Absolutely. Some churches do have, the veil of the confessional.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, some of my Roman Catholic colleagues, if something was said in that context, it would be really difficult. I've always taken the view in confidentiality that unless I thought that somebody's own life or somebody else's life was at risk,
Mm-hmm.
I would, of course, preserve that confidentiality. If there was a high risk scenario, I would then probably elicit the support of the doctor to try and get somebody sectioned if they had to be,
Mm-hmm.
or to ensure that the officers who were also looking after the same individual, and it's not just soldiers, these are sometimes officers who get
Yes.
themselves in
Yeah.
trouble, that whoever was in their hierarchy, their chain of command, was also equally aware of their needs. And we
Mm-hmm.
did what we could to support them at their time of need.
Mm-hmm. And the other question I had was, the role of chaplain. Did you find that then, in cases, turned into, I suppose by nature it's evangelical, but did it turn into that sort of, through these relationships where you were finding yourself walking people to, in their faith, to maybe to be with, to be a believer, or to be, do you find you were walking through that kind of evangelical process, or was it very much, restraining from that, but still providing that level of support?
I think the level of support is for me was the key.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I was the deputy chaplain general before I became the chaplain general, I had some gardening leave.
Mm-hmm.
We had 6 weeks off, which my wife said I didn't do any gardening. But I had time to think and reflect and pray about what I was going to set up as my priorities when I became the chaplain general.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the garden, literally in the garden one day, and my wife said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I need to go in and write something down," because it suddenly came to me, what is the relationship between the soldier and the chaplain? What does the soldier and their families look for or seek from their chaplain?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a divine inspiration that I came to the conclusion that they wanted somebody who was prayerful, who
Mm-hmm.
was professional, and who had a positive effect upon their lives and the lives of their families.
Mm-hmm.
Prayerful, professional, and positive. And in return, as the chaplain general, I tried to ensure that all our ministers and priests who came to the army as chaplains were ministerially fulfilled, vocationally nurtured, and professionally equipped to do the job that God had called them to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's a national shortage of clergy, and we were very privileged that the churches, what we call descending churches, the
Mm-hmm.
Church of England, Catholic Church, Methodist Church,
Mm-hmm.
and the United Board, as well as the Church of Scotland, allowed ministers and priests to come and serve alongside soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And the was something the army really wanted,
Mm-hmm.
and it was something that we did our best to. So our recruitment was quite a big agenda, and we recruited some really high caliber people.
Yeah, I'm
because
sure.
I felt that, and they had to go through the Army Officer Selection Board and be selected properly, because I didn't feel we were serving the individual as a minister or a priest or the army well if we were recruiting people who were not up to the mark.
Yeah, yeah,
And there's
exactly,
an honesty in that.
exactly. And I'm sort of wondering then, did people ever, just from attending, I suppose the church services, or getting to know you, were the people that would have asked you, have said, this whole God thing, maybe it is real, maybe I believe in it. Will you pray for me and help me walk through that? Was there people that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that, that's a privilege that all chaplains, all ministers, in fact, all Christians can do. That
Yes.
we, I think that you don't wear your heart on your sleeve, you don't wear your faith on your sleeve, but people know, because of the environment you're working in, they know whether you're living the gospel when you're with them so often.
Yes.
If you are saying one thing and doing something else, soldiers can spot a bluff at 1,000 yards.
Absolutely. Anyone
And
can.
absolutely, so you need to be true to your faith, and you need to be true to the faith needs of others, and being able to pray with people, to be able to offer them communion on a battlefield, is an extraordinary privilege. to be able to have that word in season, that right word of somebody saying, even people saying, I don't believe in anything. You say, well, you've got to realize that, God's kingdom does not stop the day you put on an army uniform.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
and therefore, you have the opportunity to grow as a Christian. And there is that evangelical side where people absolutely come to faith. Traumatic incidences cause people to reflect more deeply.
Yeah.
Especially when their colleagues are being badly wounded or killed. When growing men cry, because sometimes it's only the chaplain and the words of the gospel that can speak to them.
Yeah, I could only imagine being in that position where, I mean, it's a trauma that I've never experienced, having seen someone's life, taken before your eyes, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be to walk through that process with someone. And
yeah.
It's obviously, it goes beyond the normal realms of grief counseling, and, it goes a level further because these are things that are not just deaths, but traumatic deaths in a lot of experiences.
And of course, an awful lot of this is happening away from the normal support networks. It's away from home. It's away from family. It's away from friends. It may be the first couple of days into a 6-month deployment. And you know that you're never going to get back for the funeral. You know you're never going to get back to that family.
Yeah.
And yet you've got to get up the next morning and go out and do the same thing again.
And I don't even know how you comprehend that. But do you find that people, they find a way to get through these challenges? Is that
I think part of the way is that the Army's got and the other services, but certainly the Army's got a thing called the buddy system. So people are taught from day one to look after each other.
Okay.
So when you're in the environment, people work very closely together. They care deeply for each other. They look after each other. And if they see somebody, especially if it's been an incident where maybe somebody's no longer behaving the way they normally do, or they're having sleepless nights, or they're exercising signs of stress or trauma, then they're very quick now to identify that and to signpost people to, you need to go and have a word with the padre. You need to go and see the doctor. You need to go and talk to the trauma risk management corporal, because you need to pull yourself together, because my life could depend on what you do tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. Where did padre come from? Why the,
It's Spanish for father. So the whole capella, the old chaplain idea is a very old term. The idea of the chaplain coming from the idea of the cloak. So Martin of Tours taking his cloak off to put over the wounded man. The idea of the cloak being placed on a soldier's shoulder because he's cold or he's frightened is a very powerful image. So on my uniform I would say Padre Coulter, or Father Smith. And it becomes a very generic term. So the youngest soldier, you would go into the camp in the morning, and the youngest soldier would say, "Good morning, Padre." You go to the commanding officer, the senior soldier, and he would say, "Good morning, Padre." It's a completely unifying title.
And what's that like to minister? I'm sure you've had plenty of experience working with these people who are maybe high up in the ranks. Do you find there's an interesting dynamic where you're, maybe 1 minute you're talking to, a corporal or something like that, and then the next you could be up, someone way above that? And
I think it's the, the chaplain's department is a pyramid, as it is with the rest of the army. So people do get promoted and move up the ranks. They still retain their chaplaincy credentials. They still need their license from their church, and they still retain that padre soldier relationship. And of course, the senior officers have grown up with this. It is the senior officers who will say, "I am not going to deploy to Afghanistan without my own chaplain." It is the senior officers who realized what a chaplain did for their soldiers, when they were young officers. And they will often, even very, very, very senior people, the head of the army, I've been to see, who will come in, "Would you like a cup of tea or coffee?" The door's shut, and you have a completely open conversation.
They spill their heart out for you,
You can do.
Gosh, yeah.
Or it's very businesslike. It may be an operational matter that they want to discuss. It may be just they need a bit of downtime because they're under huge pressure themselves,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for them to talk about something else other than about the next operation or the
Yeah.
next uh,
Mm.
incident that they're dealing with. The human side of it is really important. That's what
Yeah.
makes them good soldiers.
And have you ever dealt with people perhaps that are having issues of conscience, in their time working with the in the army? Do you ever get people that think, oh, maybe they get an order and have an issue where, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. Have you ever get people that maybe back out or think, oh, I don't know if I can do this? Is that
Yeah,
something comes up?
I'm trying to think of if I can think of a specific question. I know when I was at the military academy, there was a young, very idealistic young
Mm-hmm.
trainee officer cadet who decided he was going to become a conscientious objector. I think he suddenly realized he was in the military, didn't want to be.
Yeah.
Um, the army works as well as it does because we have what are called the core values: courage, loyalty, discipline, integrity, selfless commitment, and
Mm-hmm.
respect for others. So those 6 core values, which young soldiers are taught from day one, and um, which senior officers hold to even at the
Mm-hmm.
highest, at the top of the army.
Couldn't work without it. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's the glue that keeps the whole thing together. And I think it's the core values. So respect for others,
Mm-hmm.
or integrity, loyalty, and discipline are things which um, people recognize. And if somebody was to say, I'm gay and I can no longer be in this environment, or they want to say, I really do not believe, if you're a Muslim soldier and you do
Mm-hmm.
not want to serve in a Muslim country, then that could be seen as conscientious objection, but would be dealt with really sensitively and
Mm-hmm.
seriously.
I was going to say then, is there concessions that are perhaps made in terms of, it could officially be seen a certain way, but, maybe, do they find ways around, where they can make concessions, or
Well,
how's that dealt with?
yeah, I don't think we make concessions. I think we treat people with great respect and
Mm,
dignity. Apart from the Christian chaplains that we had, I had 5 faith advisors from the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Jew, the Sikh, and the
mm,
Muslim community, who would provide me with real time advice.
mm,
So, if, for example, you are, I've seen, Josh, some young Muslim soldiers praying 5 times a day, being more devout than any evangelical Christian I know.
yep,
And I've also seen soldiers, non-Christian soldiers, being on duty to allow Christian soldiers to celebrate Christmas, for example,
mm,
because they know that the flip side is that when it's their religious festival,
yeah.
one of the Christian soldiers would do the same. It's that
Mm-hmm.
give and take. It's not concessions.
It's a brotherhood, really, is what you're describing.
Brotherhood is, yeah, and now that there are girls in the infantry, over the summer, the Trooping of the Colour, which took place at Windsor rather than London, the
Mm-hmm.
big parade that happens for the Queen's birthday.
Yes, yeah.
On the parade was the first female guardsman
Mm,
in the Welsh Guards. So there are girls now serving in the front
yeah.
line with the regiments. Now that's a tough call, really, because it's a very physically demanding role. It's a very macho environment,
Yeah.
but the girls are tough, and the
Mm-hmm.
girls are given their place because they are the right people to do these jobs.
Mm. Well, I don't know if you ever watched do you ever watch the SAS show that's on TV?
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's interesting the way they described it, because it's exactly how you would hope it would be dealt with, where every girl that's in the army is expected to keep up with every man, and there's no weak links. Whether it's, people make the argument that women are biologically, it's natural less strong in some ways, but if they have to be able to keep up with the demands of the job, and that's the way you would have hoped that it would have been dealt with. And
Yeah,
uh,
I think certainly in the the part of the risk is the whole psychological thing about being in the front line,
mm-hmm,
and the bearing of arms, and that if a girl, because it's not being sexist, but if a girl gets injured, are the men going to react differently than if one of their colleagues got injured? The
mm,
answer is probably not, because they're all trained exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a real sense that, they're not gender neutral. Women are still going to be women, men are still going to be men.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly when I was in the Army headquarters, tens of thousands, if not millions of pounds were spent on scientific testing to ensure that no female was going to do untold damage by trying to be an infantry soldier.
Mm. Yeah.
Because that's just so important. This is somebody's life you're talking about.
Absolutely. And yeah, there's obviously that trust, but it must have been interesting, for, I guess, when the first few women did join in, I'm sure it was an interesting dynamic to, suddenly there's, where it was all men for forever, really, to see the first few women.
And you'll have maybe seen the university, but here, where I live now, there's a boys' boarding school
mm-hmm.
has just decided to take girls.
Mm-hmm. That's the way.
Now,
that's the way things are going these days. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's not even a boarding school; it's a day school.
Okay.
But the problem is they didn't have any gents and ladies' loos.
Oh yeah, of course.
They didn't have gents and ladies' changing rooms. They didn't have female sports teachers.
No, there's all these logistics to think about now.
Exactly. So and you're not going to have mixed accommodation in a barrack block. So you have to accommodate people for who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To the best you can. And I've never been to an army barracks that's had gender neutral toilets.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that's what you find in universities and other places.
I mean, again, on the SAS show that they don't do that. They don't. They make a point really of the women are there with the guys, and there's whether it's they're getting changed together, going to the bathroom together. They make that point, I guess, in that show of showing that if you're gonna go to war together, you have to be at all levels of comfortable.
Exactly, and that's in the training environment and in the operational environment. It's not in the peacetime environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you there.
Okay.
I was going to say I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I guess the whole concept of Christians being involved in the military. Now, I've talked to some people on this show before, who have differing views on this. I've heard views. I was talking to a guy called Alex Atwell who writes some music, where he would be very much of the opinion that Christians should be pacifist and shouldn't get involved in the wars and military, because it's really a repeating cycle of violence that can't be ever stopped unless there's a stop of people getting involved. Did you ever have any issues? I think you mentioned earlier you felt very comfortable being involved in the army. Have you ever had any thoughts or doubts as to whether this is the thing for you or whether it's right for you to be involved in the armed forces?
Yeah, the pacifist question frequently comes up. I think I said to you before, Josh, that God's kingdom doesn't stop the day you put on an army uniform. It's also been said that the chaplain can often be the only welfare worker, pastoral care worker on the field of battle. And that if we are to turn our backs on the soldiers when they go to war, because this is what people are asked to do, then we're serving them not at all well. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I genuinely believe that while of course we pray every Sunday for a peaceful world, and we pray that God's kingdom would take over. But of course, you and I know that as we speak tonight, there are people going into harm's way to do really difficult and dangerous jobs, and chaplains have got the privilege to serve alongside them. And the difference is that the chaplain is on the field of battle, not carrying a weapon.
It's an interesting question to me because I guess it comes up in conversation, this whole idea of, I suppose, the just war. Does God condone some military action? I don't know if I'll ever be fully, I don't know if anyone can ever be fully decided on that question. I know a lot of people that insist that there's absolutely no justification for a Christian to be involved in violence, never mind war. Some people say even if someone was to, I've heard friends say, if someone was to burst in through the front door trying to harm your family, you know, that they would try, I mean, other than restraint, they would never, you know, perhaps if there was a gun lying around, they wouldn't think, you know, to ever use that to stop someone from doing harm to their family. So I've heard a lot of different points, a lot of different points of view, and I don't think I would necessarily agree in total non-violence, because I think I've just seen too many cases in the Old Testament, which, to be fair, people will say there's differences in the Old and New Testament and how that applies today, but I've seen too many examples, I think, of heavenly or sort of violence that has been condoned by God for very specific purposes in terms of actually bringing about good in the world. I was just wondering on your views on that sort of this question of whether violence and Christianity, is that something that can ever work together?
They live in real tension with each other, don't they? And I think there is, you know, why do we have armed forces? You know, why do we have nuclear weapons? You know, it is a constant battle. I think chaplains spend a lot of time thinking about these things and talking to soldiers about these things. I think that there is, you know, what's that? I was trying to remember the quotation. I'll get it wrong now. About evil men only succeed where good men do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That's a misquote,
Yeah.
but you know, and I think that we have a moral responsibility to bear arms and to do what is right, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we as chaplains are called to serve alongside those who may be required to take life. And, you know, that is really difficult. And I've known some chaplains who have given, you know, even evangelical Protestant chaplains who have given almost confession and absolution opportunities to soldiers because of the trauma of what they've been part of, either taking somebody else's life themselves, or indeed seeing one of their friends' lives taken away.
And are there those then that would feel like they have sinned by doing those
actions? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is, you know, when you're in these very rare but very high intensity life and death situations, then to bring any comfort to that situation is for the good of everybody.
That's very challenging to think of, you know, because you would think that if someone's comfortable with the idea of joining the army, really, and doing that they would be then okay with what comes with that job. But I suppose until you're in that situation, you don't know how you'll feel.
Exactly. And I think, you know, it's a bit like being in the centre of London when one of these attacks is happening. You know, at London Bridge, you've seen on the television, or
Yes.
in the Barrow Market thing. You know, with either weapons or knives are being used with great violence. You know, do you stop and pray? You're probably running down the corridor praying. I would be, I guess.
Yeah.
But actually, if you were suddenly round the corner and there was the assailant in front of you, what would you do?
Yeah. Yep. That's what I don't know if we're designed to be totally no. You know, to not resist that kind of evil.
No.
No. And I think there's a distinction for sure between, in my mind anyway, between violence for the sake of evil and violence for the few cases where that, you know, that
and often soldiers, sailors, and airmen are being put in harm's way to stand between warring factions, to stand between tribal factions where they know that you know, a bomb has been planted, possibly in Afghanistan or Iraq, that you know that children are going to walk past on the way to school tomorrow morning. And if you don't defuse that, or you don't try to stop the perpetrator of that crime, some child is going to get blown up.
Yeah. A difficult.
So
yeah.
You stand back and do nothing, or you actually go in there and put your own life at risk to do something, because that's what needs to be done.
Yeah. And did you ever find you wrestled with that tension yourself, even when you were actively serving as a soldier? I know you said you loved it, but did those ever come up in your mind?
I think it was it was quite passive because Iraq and Afghanistan hadn't kicked off. I think when the first Gulf War started, my eldest son was only 3 months old when we deployed to the desert in the first Gulf War in 1991. The one of the things I decided to do, I was actually with the artillery. I was seconded to the artillery in the desert. Was that I would consciously every day sit outside my tent or outside I was actually sleeping in the back of an armored ambulance.
Mm-hmm.
And I would after breakfast every day, I would sit down and say my prayers. I'd read my Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say my prayers in the same place, in the public view of all the other vehicles, as almost as a witness.
Yeah.
And then on the Sundays, I had people who would come, and many of whom I knew never darkened the church door.
Mm-hmm.
This is before we went into the war. What were they looking for? Is it a comfort blanket? Is it because their friends went? In one situation, one of the company commanders said to me, our battery commander said, Padre, do you do baptisms? I said, yeah, I do baptism. Why? He said, well, I've got a soldier who's terrified he's going to die. And he wants to be baptized.
Wow.
And I said, well, let me speak to him. So I met this young man, and he sat in my Land Rover, and we talked. And I said, look, explain the situation. He told me that he was frightened. He thought he was going to die. He'd never been baptized. He always wanted to be baptized. And his fiancée back in England would expect him to be baptized. I said, okay, I'm going to come back here next week, and I will baptize you on one condition. Firstly, two conditions. The first is you're prepared as an adult to make the promises in adult baptism. And secondly, you invite your friends.
Yeah.
So I went back the next week. I discovered that the whole battery had been invited. So there were about 125 guys standing in a little horseshoe.
Yeah.
This young man, we had a little service in the desert. There'd been a little washing bowl put up, and he came in front of me. I put the promises to him. Do you believe in God? Do you want to be baptized and into the Christian church? He said yes to all the promises. And then he knelt down in the desert in front of all his friends and was baptized.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, I'll never forget that. And I can certainly, he never forget that. And I'm damn sure every one of those soldiers who was there will never forget it.
Yeah, well, that would be an amazing, obviously, experience to witness. And I'll use that word again. What a great witness that he had then to, the bravery to do that in front of his friends.
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, that thought of having, it just came to my mind there that you are really ministering to people in a place where very few get to go, in terms of you're facing men that are very in touch with the concept of their own mortality.
Correct.
You're like the last frontier between them and their maker. You're working on that boundary really. And I guess it just hit me that you get to minister to people really in a very different place to anyone else.
Yeah. And you earn the right to be there. By living and working with them, and being open to their needs, and then being open into yours. Because I knew in the desert, in when the bombs and bullets were flying, that they would look after me in the way that I would try and look after them.
Absolutely. Amazing. And another question that I had for you is another thing that came up in my interview with Alex. I should really tell you who he is first. He's a friend of mine that I've known for a while. I can't say I agree with everything that he says, but I had him on the show because he writes music really that's intentionally provocative in a way, but it's really his way of processing what's going through his mind. And his ministry by nature is of peace and reconciliation. That's the slant and what he works with. So therefore, I suppose it's natural he's working through these issues of pacifism and violence, and even in terms of remembrance. He's written songs about the concept of Remembrance Sunday, and in some ways he said he had an uneasy feeling of looking at people, this issue of this idea of remembering what could be considered, well, I'm not going to say an evil act, but in his mind he would have said a harmful act of war. So, what would, in your opinion, be the proper way for Christians to remember the service of soldiers and to remember war?
Yeah, I think there are sort of key words, like service and sacrifice. This is about commemoration. Um, Again, I was fortunate when I was the Chaplain General between 2014 and 2018. There were a lot of big national commemorative events, um, marking 100th anniversaries of major battles in the First World War, from the Battle of the Somme, Gallipoli. Even we had things like Agincourt, Waterloo, the 200th anniversary of Waterloo, and the up to the end of the war with Somme, Passchendaele, and then the conclusion of the war. Huge national events, and so often with heads of state and royal representatives, who felt it was important on behalf of the nation to mark the service and the sacrifice. And I think one of the things that my French colleagues found strange was that we always involved a Christian act of worship. Whereas in France, you have a military parade and then you have a church service, but the two things are not combined. Whereas in our world, we would always have the two together. We would have a drumhead service, we would have an act of remembrance, we would have words of commemoration, we would have prayers, and asking God's blessing upon those soldiers, sailors, and airmen and their families who gave so much.
And is there any conflict in your mind when it comes to just the thought of a Christian being involved in the military, which by nature is violent and is involved in war?
Yeah, I don't think there's any conflict in it when you are there to support those who have to do the fighting. That you are there to look after these people who God has sent into harm's way. They draw strength with the fact that you, as a Christian minister or priest, are prepared to sit alongside them to face the same dangers that they are facing. We can't airbrush history, and I know there's been a lot of that recently in all sorts of ways. And I think, as far as military service is concerned, we certainly shouldn't try to airbrush what people have been asked to do in the country's name, and that comes with a price.
And when it comes to the idea of being in the army, where you're naturally serving your country, is there any kind of tension between this idea of church and state? Because I know a lot of people will say that God's kingdom is the only kingdom you should serve, and this idea of serving under a worldly state is harmful. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's always going to be a tension between church and state, and the church has always got to have the freedom to speak out when it feels it's necessary to speak out. I think the biggest existential threat to Christian chaplaincy today is from the humanist. I can think of senior commanders who wouldn't claim to believe in God at all, but absolutely saw the value of chaplaincy for what chaplaincy did for their soldiers and their families. And that's always been the case in war, and it's been the case historically, and it's been the case in the past, and it'll be the case in the future. I think the threat is where the humanist is trying to remove the soldier's right to have a Christian presence in their midst. And what can they offer in the field of battle?
So there's been a move to replace Christian chaplains with secular chaplains.
Absolutely, it's the biggest existential threat that chaplains is facing today. It is absolutely not from the military to invest in chaplains and to recruit them. It's because the humanists feel that they can replace chaplains, and the army was absolutely clear that they wanted Christian ministers and priests to serve soldiers in the front line.
So, in your opinion, then, I'm just trying to understand the other point of view. What would be the benefit then of having a religious or Christian chaplain as opposed to perhaps a secular counselor type role?
I think going back to the integrity question, one of the questions is that a former chaplain general used to say one of the things that a soldier respects is that a chaplain comes value loaded.
Right.
A soldier recognizes what the chaplain stands up for. The fact you wear crosses on your collar dog, you're coming. You're not hiding anything. Whereas if a counsellor come, you don't know what they're going to bring. Whereas they know what you as a Christian minister or priest are going to do and say, and they will respect your position and you respect theirs.
Yeah, so there's a kind of universal set of values that a soldier will expect when they're speaking to a chaplain. Then,
correct, and there's an honesty about that.
So just to finish up, then I just wanted to end by asking you then, in all your years of being a military chaplain, what would you say would be one of the most memorable moments or stories that you've had over your career?
I think, Josh, there's been many things. I think praying with soldiers at time of need. I think saying prayers for the dead. People being with soldiers when their colleagues have been killed. Very precious time. I think you remember people. It's the people that you're with. And they remember you. And one of the great delights is that a soldier in the Gulf War who was with the Scottish Regiment, left the army years ago, is now a security man at Edinburgh Airport. And I was walking through Edinburgh Airport one day, and he suddenly saw me in the crowd, and I was in civilian clothes, and he said, "Padre, come on over here," and waved me through. And that was a fabulous occasion because he had touched my life and I had touched his.
Yeah, so the relationships go on forever.
Absolutely. And that's, people talk about the veteran community and the British Legion and all the old and bold who put on their uniforms and their berets and they march to the cenotaph and they turn out on Remembrance Sunday. It is those relationships which are really special, and being able to be part of that is a great privilege.
So yeah, I just wanted to finish off by saying to you now, how grateful I am for you taking the time out to talk to me tonight. And I just wanted to reiterate, this idea of, I wanted to thank you for your service, because I'm sure you've touched many lives over the course of your career, and there's been so many, obviously, that you've had an impact on. So, and yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to speak to me tonight, and for your service.
Well, Josh, I'm really grateful for you taking the time and for taking this up. When I was thinking this afternoon, and in church this morning, and then come to talk to you, I was thinking, how would we encapsulate this in prayer? And I could only think of the chaplain's collect, so the prayer. So every regiment in the army has got its own prayer or collect, and the collect of the Royal Army Chaplains Department is, blessed God, who's committed the glorious gospel to our trust, have mercy upon the Royal Army Chaplains Department, and grant that we may never glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, but in all things may prove ourselves as thy ministers, through Christ's sake. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks again, Reverend Dr. David Coulter. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us tonight.
No, bless you. Thanks so much, and you take care.